So in the sort of colonial conception of a Hindu joint family, in the sort of South India, this was governed by something called the Mitakshara Code of Law. Within this system, property was held jointly by the male patrilineal kin. So in other words, the grandfather, the sons, the grandsons. And women really had no ownership relationship in this. Their access to property was only through their relationship to men, either as daughters or as wives or as widows. By the early 20th century, there were a number of sort of criticisms emerging, first from men of this system of joint ownership. And the men who questioned this tended to be people from what I call the sort of professional or merchant or mercantile classes. These were men who, if they were professionals, were doctors or lawyers and were making a lot more money through their profession than they were through their family land. And so they were eager to sort of lay claim to that property as themselves being the owners, their so-called separate property, as opposed to property that belonged to the family as a whole. So they argued that their property should be for the protection and support, a man might say, for his own wife, not for his whole extended kin networks. And so this sort of opens up space in an interesting way for women to also try to assert their rights to property. But again, it's through the relationship to a man, right? It's their right as wives. But in 1937, something changes as well. A new law called the Hindu Women's Rights to Property Act was passed at the All India level. So in Madras, this leads to a lot of court cases where women are trying to assert kind of greater control over this property when their husbands die, right, when they're widows. But in most cases, the courts decide that women's right to property is really limited by something called a woman's estate. So rather than suggesting that women own property outright, so if your husband dies, you gain his property outright, they say, well, the woman has the right to use it while she's alive, but after she dies, it will continue on to her husband's heirs. So it's a very limited form of ownership that's granted to women, even though the law itself is called the Hindu Women's Rights to Property Act, right? So you might think that it kind of expands women's access. It does in certain ways, but always with the idea that a woman is dependent on men.